You just fired the man who owns this place. I'd think very carefully about what you put in that termination letter. When Regional Manager Diane Rowe fires Marcus Hale from his mechanic job at a suburban auto shop, she thinks she's silenced the one employee brave enough to report her fraud. But the next morning, labor attorney Elena Vasquez, hired by Hale Automotive Group to investigate worker complaints at that very shop, stumbles onto a signature that changes everything. The man in the coveralls wasn't just a mechanic. He was the billionaire who owned the entire chain. And Elena, who built her career on trusting documents over people, is about to learn that the most dangerous thing she ever did wasn't breaking protocol. It was almost letting the truth walk out the door in a pair of grease-stained boots. The fluorescent lights in the back office of AutoCare Plus on Route 9 had been flickering for 11 days. Marcus Hale had put in a maintenance request on day 2. On day 4, he'd fixed the ballast himself during his lunch break, because waiting for corporate to approve a $40 repair felt like watching a man drown while someone searched for the liability waiver. Diane Rowe, regional manager for the Mid-Atlantic division of Hale Automotive Group, had sent him a written warning for performing unauthorized electrical work on company property. That warning was now sitting in a manila folder on her desk, next to 2 others she'd manufactured over the past 6 weeks. And she was holding all 3, like a hand of cards she was finally ready to play. "Sit down, Marcus," she said without looking up from the folder. He sat. He was still in his work uniform, the dark navy coveralls with the AutoCare Plus logo stitched in orange above the left breast pocket, his name in white thread below it. There was a streak of motor oil along his right forearm that he hadn't had time to wash off. He'd been midway through a brake job on a 2019 Civic when Diane's assistant had knocked on the bay door and told him the regional manager needed him immediately. He'd wiped his hands on a shop rag, told his coworker Ramon to keep the car on the lift, and walked in. He did not look like a man who was afraid. That bothered Diane more than anything else about him. "I'm going to be direct with you," she said, opening the folder. "We've been documenting a pattern of behavior over the past month and a half that constitutes a serious violation of AutoCare Plus employee conduct standards." She slid the first warning across the desk. Unauthorized repair of company electrical infrastructure. The second, verbal confrontation with a supervisor in front of customers. The third, unauthorized access to the shop management system outside your clearance level. Marcus looked at each paper as it appeared. He didn't pick them up. He read them where they lay, which took about 4 seconds per page, and then he looked at Diane. "The electrical work saved the company a service call and kept the lights on in Bay 3, he said. "The verbal confrontation you're describing was me telling your floor supervisor that we were billing a customer for a transmission flush we didn't perform. And the system access, what clearance level exactly are you saying I exceeded?" "The management portal requires regional authorization, Marcus." "I know what it requires." His voice was even, not aggressive, just precise, the way a man talks when he knows the terrain better than the person trying to redirect him. "I'm asking you to tell me specifically which access log you're citing because I'd like to see it." Diane closed the folder. "That's not how this works." "How does it work?" "It works like this." She slid a 4th sheet across the desk. This one was different. White paper company letterhead already signed at the bottom. "We're terminating your employment effective immediately. You'll receive 2 weeks severance in accordance with your contract. Please return your badge and your locker key to the front desk." The room was quiet, except for the sound of an air compressor cycling on in the bay, outside a low, mechanical exhale that vibrated faintly through the wall. Marcus looked at the termination letter. He looked at it for a long moment, not the way someone looks at a document they're trying to understand, but the way someone looks at something they already understand completely and are deciding what to do about it. "You just fired the man who owns this place," he said. His voice was still even. "I'd think very carefully about what you put in that termination letter." Diane met his eyes for the first time since he'd sat down. "You're a mechanic, Marcus. You've been with us for 8 weeks. You don't own anything." He stood up. He straightened the front of his coveralls in a gesture that was almost formal. "My daughter's outside. I'm going to go get her, and we're going to leave." but I want you to understand something before I do. He picked up the termination letter not to keep it, just to hold it for a moment, the way you hold something you're about to set back down. Every number you've submitted to corporate for this region for the last 18 months is wrong. You know that. I know that. And pretty soon the people you work for are going to know that too. He set the letter back on her desk, face down. Diane kept her expression perfectly still. She had spent 11 years in regional management learning to keep her expression perfectly still. "Good luck to you," she said. He walked out. Elena Vasquez had been sitting in the parking lot of AutoCare Plus for 22 minutes when the man in the navy coveralls came through the front door, holding a 6-year-old girl by the hand. She noticed him because of how he walked. Not fast, not angry, just deliberate, like a person who had somewhere specific to be, and had already decided exactly how they were going to get there. The little girl had a backpack shaped like a turtle and was eating a fruit strip she'd apparently produced from one of the backpack's pockets without breaking stride. She said something to the man, and he bent down briefly to hear her, and whatever she said made the corner of his mouth move upward by approximately 3 degrees. Elena noted him in the small spiral notebook she kept for first impressions. "Single father," she wrote. "Terminated today or recently?" "No, terminated today. Still in uniform. Calm affect. Not performing calm. Actually calm. Worth talking to." She had driven up from Washington, D.C. that morning. Her client, or rather the entity that had retained her firm, was Hale Automotive Group, which owned 47 AutoCare Plus locations across 6 mid-Atlantic states and had recently received 3 separate internal whistleblower complaints from employees at this specific location. The complaints all described the same pattern: falsified service records customers billed for work not performed, and workers pressured to sign off on jobs they hadn't done or face consequences. One complaint mentioned a supervisor who told a mechanic to either adjust his numbers or find another job. Elena's job was to determine whether the complaints had merit, identify the responsible parties, and produce a report that would allow Hale Group's legal team to act. She had 48 hours to conduct preliminary interviews before the company's general counsel wanted an initial assessment. She had not yet gone inside. She was finishing her coffee and reviewing the personnel file summaries her contact at Hale Group's HR department had sent over. There were 9 full-time employees at this location, a manager, a regional supervisor, and in a separate attachment, her contact had noted somewhat cryptically as, "For your awareness, not for distribution," a reference to an ongoing internal review she was not authorized to access. She had filed that away and moved on. Elena Vasquez had been doing employment law for 9 years, and she had learned early that there was always a document someone didn't want you to see, and that document almost always mattered, and that the fastest way to get to it was to start with the people who had the least to lose. The man in the coveralls was putting his daughter in the backseat of a dark blue Ford F250 that had seen considerable use. Elena noted the truck noted the plates and then looked back at her files. His name was in there. Marcus Hale, hired 8 weeks ago, no prior disciplinary record, listed as primary caregiver for 1 minor child. His emergency contact field was blank. She would need to interview him. Not today. Today she needed to go inside and establish her presence and collect the baseline documentation. But soon. She closed her notebook, finished her coffee, and walked into AutoCare Plus, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the specific expression she'd cultivated for initial site visits. Professional, unhurried, radiating the particular variety of competence that made people feel it would be easier to cooperate than to resist. The woman behind the front desk looked up. "Can I help you?" "Elena Vasquez from Kellerman & Associates. I'm here to meet with Diane Rowe." She set her card on the counter. "She's expecting me." Diane Rowe was not, in fact, happy to see her. She was professionally cordial in the way that regional managers who have things to hide are always professionally cordial with corporate-appointed investigators. She shook Elena's hand firmly, offered coffee that Elena declined, and led her back to the same office where 40 minutes earlier she had handed Marcus Hale his termination letter. The chair on the far side of the desk was still slightly displaced from where he'd pushed it back when he stood. Diane straightened it before she sat down. "I appreciate you coming in person," Diane said. "These situations are always easier to resolve face-to-face." "I find that too," Elena said. She opened a briefcase and extracted a legal pad and a small digital recorder. "Do you mind?" She held up the recorder. A beat. "Of course not." Elena placed the recorder on the desk and clicked it on. "Can you walk me through the structure of operations here? I'd like to understand the reporting chain before I start with individual interviews." Diane walked her through it. She was smooth, not evasive exactly, but the way someone is smooth when they've rehearsed the version of events they want you to receive. Elena listened and took notes, and asked follow-up questions that seemed to go in one direction while she was actually triangulating from a different angle. She had learned this technique from an opposing counsel who'd once spent 45 minutes appearing to ask her client about one thing while quietly building a picture of something else entirely. She had been so impressed by it that she'd stolen it and never given it back. At one point, she said almost offhandedly, "I noticed from the personnel files that you terminated an employee today. Marcus Hale?" Something shifted in Diane's posture. Not much, just a slight reorganization of the muscles around her shoulders. "That's correct. Any connection to the complaint investigation or routine performance?" "Routine performance," Diane said. He'd been documenting problems since his first week, difficulty following procedures. "We gave him multiple opportunities." She gestured at the folder still sitting at the corner of her desk. "It's all documented." Elena glanced at the folder. "I may need to review his personnel file as part of the broader employee documentation." "Of course. I'll have HR send it over." "Thank you." Elena made a note. Not of what Diane had said, she had the recorder for that, but of the exact moment Diane's left hand had flattened against the desk when the name came up. It was an involuntary gesture. People made those gestures when a topic was connected to something they needed to control. She would be talking to Marcus Hale very soon. She spent the rest of the afternoon interviewing 3 current employees. Ramon Diaz, who had worked in Bay 2 for 4 years and who said almost nothing of substance, but his eyes moved toward the office every time Elena asked about billing procedures. A service writer named Keisha Todd, who was very young and very careful, and who said everything was fine 3 times before Elena had asked her once. And a parts manager named Gus Okafor, who had apparently decided somewhere between his first and second sentence that Elena was trustworthy, and who told her quietly, with his hands folded on the break room table, that the numbers were wrong. "Which numbers?" Elena asked. "All of them," Gus said. "The service records, the parts, inventory, the labor hours. What goes in the system doesn't match what we actually do. It hasn't for a long time." "How long?" He thought about it. "Since before my time, but I've been here 3 years, and it was already a pattern when I started." "Who enters the numbers?" "Diane approves everything before it goes to corporate. But the initial entries, those come from the floor supervisors. Or they're supposed to." He paused. "Sometimes entries appear that nobody on the floor submitted." Elena wrote that down. "Did you report this to anyone?" "I filed an internal complaint 6 months ago." He looked at her steadily. "Nothing happened. Then Marcus Hale filed one 2 weeks ago. And today, he got fired." Elena drove back to her hotel that night with 4 hours of recorded interviews, a legal pad of notes, and the specific, uncomfortable feeling she always got when the surface of a case was clean and the ground underneath it was not. She opened the personnel file Diane had sent over and read Marcus Hale's record in full. It was clean. Spotlessly, surgically clean. 8 weeks of employment, no prior discipline before the 3 warnings generated in the past 6 weeks, good performance marks from his first month. But the 3 warnings all came within a 40-day window that happened to coincide exactly with the date he'd submitted his internal complaint. And the 3rd warning, unauthorized system access, listed a specific portal login that Elena's experience told her was not typically accessible to a line mechanic. She made a note to look into what that portal actually was. She set her legal pad on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. Through the window of the hotel room, Route 9 glowed orange with the lights of fast food restaurants and a gas station, and 3 blocks east, the darkened sign of AutoCare Plus. She thought about the man in the navy coveralls walking out with his daughter, calm as someone who knew the tide was going to turn. She thought about what he had said to Diane. She hadn't heard it, but she'd seen Diane's face 3 minutes later, and Diane's face had looked like someone who'd touched something cold unexpectedly. Elena Vasquez did not trust hunches. She trusted documents. But she picked her legal pad back up and wrote at the top of a fresh page, "What portal requires regional authorization, and who else has the access code?" The address in Marcus Hale's personnel file was a house on Caldwell Street, 12 minutes from the shop, in a neighborhood of mature oak trees and wide driveways, and houses that had been built in the early 90s and were now either beautifully maintained or quietly neglected, with very little in between. Number 44 was toward the better end of the spectrum. The lawn was mowed, the front porch had 2 chairs and a child's bicycle leaning against the railing, and someone had recently planted something in the narrow bed along the front walkway. The dirt still dark and fresh around the stems. Elena rang the doorbell at 9:15 on a Tuesday morning. She heard from somewhere inside the house the sound of a cartoon at moderate volume, and the specific quality of silence that means someone has just registered a doorbell and is deciding whether to answer it. The door opened. Marcus Hale was in jeans and a gray Henley, no grease on his arms today, and he looked at her with the mild, measuring expression of a man who is not particularly surprised by anything. "Ms. Vasquez?" he said. "Mr. Hale?" She held up her card, which he didn't take. He already knew who she was. "I'd like to ask you a few questions if you have time. You're not obligated to speak with me. I want to be clear about that. But I think your perspective would be useful." He considered her for a moment, then stepped back from the door. "Come in." The inside of the house was the kind of orderly that takes sustained effort to maintain with a young child. Everything had a place. The kitchen counter she could see from the entryway was clean, except for a bowl of cereal and a glass of orange juice, and a library book lying open spine up. From the living room came the sound of a cartoon character explaining something about dinosaurs. "Lily," Marcus called. "I'm going to be in the kitchen for a little while, okay? Don't change the channel." "Okay, Daddy." A pause. "Can I have more cereal?" "You have cereal. It's almost gone." "Then you have some cereal." He led Elena to the kitchen table. He didn't offer coffee. He sat down across from her, folded his hands, and waited. Elena set her recorder on the table. "Do you mind?" He looked at the recorder. "Yes," he said. "I do." She paused. In 9 years, 3 people had ever said yes to that question. She put the recorder back in her bag. "Okay, notes only then. If you want." She opened her legal pad. "You filed an internal complaint with Hale Automotive Group's HR department on the 14th of last month. Can you describe what prompted that?" "I observed a pattern of service records being adjusted after completion," he said. "Jobs that were marked as fully performed hadn't been. Customers were being billed for parts and labor that were never applied. I documented 7 specific instances over a 3-week period and submitted them with the complaint." "And those documents, do you have copies?" "I kept copies of what I submitted." He said it the way someone says something that sounds simple but isn't. "I'd like to see them." "I know you would." He was quiet for a moment. "Who are you working for, Ms. Vasquez?" "Hale Automotive Group retained my firm to investigate the whistleblower complaints at that location." "So you work for the company?" "I work for the investigation," she said. It was a distinction she made on principle and usually believed. "My obligation is to determine the facts and report them accurately." He held her gaze. His eyes were the particular shade of dark brown that doesn't give much away in good lighting, and he was sitting in good lighting. "Diane Rowe has been submitting inflated performance numbers to corporate for at least 18 months, he said. "She does it by requiring floor employees to sign off on service records they didn't verify, and by entering line items into the shop management system herself after hours using an override function that's supposed to be logged and audited but hasn't been. The complaints your clients received are accurate. The scope is broader than any individual complaint describes. Elena wrote steadily. How do you know about the override function? I've seen it used. The third warning in your personnel file says you access the management portal at a clearance level beyond your authorization. It does say that. Is that accurate? What exactly is the clearance level for a line mechanic, Ms. Vasquez? She looked up from her legal pad. He was watching her with the kind of patience that isn't passivity. It was attention, careful and complete, the kind a person develops when they've spent a long time in rooms where missing details cost something real. The management portal, she said, according to the documentation I've seen, requires regional authorization to access the service record editing function. Then your documentation is incomplete, he said, because the function I accessed doesn't require regional authorization. It requires a specific internal code. And the reason I had that code is something I'm not going to explain right now. Why not? Because explaining it would require telling you things that would change the nature of your investigation before you have the other evidence to make sense of it. Elena set down her pen. Mr. Hale, I'm trying to help you. I know, he said. It wasn't dismissive. He said it the way you say it when you mean the more complicated version. I know you are, and that doesn't settle everything. I have a different way of handling this. I'm asking you to do your job, collect the evidence, and let the process work. If you do that, everything will become clear. And in the meantime, you're unemployed. In the meantime, he said, I'm a single father with a 6-year-old who needs to get to school in 40 minutes, and I'd appreciate it if we wrapped up. He stood. I'll get you the copies of my complaint documentation, but I'm not signing anything. He paused at the kitchen doorway. Not the standard form, not a deposition waiver, not an NDA. Elena frowned. The NDA request isn't from me. That's a company communication. I know where it came from. He said it quietly and went to get the documents. She sat at his kitchen table and looked at the library book lying open near the cereal bowl. It was a picture book about a girl who built robots. The page it was open to showed the girl standing in a field of her creations, each one different, each one a little bit broken in a way that made it unique. The girl in the illustration looked pleased about this. Marcus came back with a manila envelope. Copies of everything I submitted, he said. Dated and time-stamped on the originals. Check the metadata if you want to verify they haven't been altered. She took the envelope. That's a very specific suggestion for someone who says they're not trying to direct the investigation. It's a logical suggestion for someone who's been accused of falsifying documents. He held the kitchen doorway with one hand. I didn't alter anything, Ms. Vasquez. The records are what I found. The question is whether you'll believe that or believe what Diane put in my file. She stood and gathered her things. As she passed him in the doorway, she stopped because she thought of something. The system access code, she said. The one you said requires a specific internal code rather than regional authorization. If I wanted to find documentation of what that code is and who has access to it, where would I look? He thought about it for a moment. Not in the way a person thinks when they don't know, but in the way a person thinks when they're deciding how much to give. The IT infrastructure manual, he said. Your client keeps it on their internal server under governance documentation. The 2022 revision, Section 7. She noted that. Then she said, because she couldn't not, how does a line mechanic know where to find the IT infrastructure manual on the corporate server? He met her eyes. Ask me again in a few days, he said. From the living room, the cartoon volume spiked as a dinosaur apparently did something significant. Marcus glanced toward the sound with that same involuntary, almost smile she'd seen in the parking lot. Elena walked to the front door. He followed. Lily, he called. Say goodbye to Ms. Vasquez. There was a shuffling sound, and a small person appeared around the corner of the hallway, still in pajamas, holding a stuffed elephant, and looking at Elena with bright, evaluating eyes. Bye, she said. Then to Marcus, "Daddy, who is she?" "Someone from work," he said. "Your work or your other work?" Lily asked. A brief silence. Elena noticed it the way she noticed everything, not dramatically, just completely. "My other work," Marcus said. And he said it easily, the way you say something you haven't quite caught yourself saying. Then he looked at Elena, and for the first time since she'd met him, something shifted in his expression. A fraction of a degree of increased stillness, like a calculation running very fast. "Thank you for your time," Elena said. She walked to her car and sat behind the wheel for a moment before she started it. She wrote in her notebook, "Your work or your other work, Lily Hale, age 6. What is the other work?" Then she drove back to her hotel and spent 4 hours going through the documents Marcus had given her. They were meticulous, dated, cross-referenced, internally consistent. She compared them against the official service records from the shop system that Diane had provided. In 6 out of 7 cases, there were discrepancies. Jobs listed as complete in the system had no corresponding technician sign-off at the correct timestamp. In 2 cases, the parts listed as used appeared in the inventory deduction log before they had been ordered. She was still looking at the parts inventory discrepancy when her phone rang. It was the HR contact at Hale Group. "I just want to flag something," the woman said. "Diane Rowe has submitted an additional document to our internal HR portal this afternoon, a supplementary conduct report on Marcus Hale dated last week. She says she forgot to include it in the termination package. And she sent over an internal email chain she says corroborates the unauthorized system access allegation." Elena kept her eyes on the screen. "Can you send those to me?" "Sending now." She opened the attachments. The supplementary report was 4 pages, crisp, well-organized. The email chain showed what appeared to be Marcus attempting to access a budget approval function and being flagged by an automated system. The dates were clear. The documentation looked clean. She read it twice. Then she checked the metadata of the attached files, the same way she checked everything, the same way she had been doing for 9 years. The supplementary report had been created 3 days after the date printed at the top of it. The email chain's metadata told her the PDF had been generated 6 days after the timestamps in the emails themselves. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The feeling she had was not quite satisfaction and not quite dread. It was the particular compound feeling of someone who has just confirmed that a problem is real and has just made it significantly more complicated at the same time. She picked up her phone and dialed Marcus Hale. He picked up on the second ring. "The documents Diane just submitted to HR," Elena said without preamble. "The supplementary conduct report and the email chain. The metadata is wrong." "I know," he said. "You couldn't know. She just sent them an hour ago." "I know because she's done it before," he said. "The metadata discrepancy is the same as the 3rd warning in my personnel file, isn't it? Created after the stated date." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes. She's not careful enough," he said. "She's been getting away with it for long enough that she's stopped being careful." "Mr. Hale," Elena chose her next words precisely. "I need you to understand that if you have information about how you anticipated this or how you know the pattern of her behavior in advance, that is material to this investigation. I can't protect what I don't know." A pause. "I understand that. Do you want to tell me?" Another pause. Longer. "Not yet," he said. "But soon." She pressed her fingers against her temple and looked out the hotel window at the orange glow of Route 9. "I'm going to keep going," she said. "I'm going to keep pulling the records, and I'm going to let the documents speak for themselves. But I want you to know that there is a version of this where you do yourself real damage by not being transparent with me." "I know," he said. And then, after a breath, "I appreciate what you're doing." She didn't know exactly why that landed the way it did. She said goodnight and hung up and sat for a while with the files open on her screen and thought about a 6-year-old who knew the difference between her father's work and his other work. The community center pool on Birchfield Road ran a Tuesday evening Learn to Swim program for children ages 4 through 7. It cost $40 for a 6-week session, which Marcus had paid in cash on the day he'd enrolled Lily, and which he would have paid again without thinking about it. Because watching his daughter's face the first time she'd figured out how to float on her back, the way she'd gone from terror to delight in the span of approximately 8 seconds, arms out, chin up, trusting the water was one of the few things over the past 3 years that had felt genuinely, simply good. He arrived at 6:45 as always. Lily was already changed and bouncing lightly on the balls of her feet at the edge of the waiting area, the way she did when the anticipation was almost more than she could hold. He signed her in, helped her adjust her goggles, and walked her to the door of the pool area, where a college student named Jalen, with patient eyes and a silver whistle, took charge of the small group and led them toward the shallow end. Marcus went to the parents' waiting area, a row of plastic chairs along the glass-walled corridor overlooking the pool. He sat in the third chair from the left, the one that had the best angle on the shallow end. He pulled out his phone, the primary one, not the second one that had been ringing twice daily for the past week, and which he had been answering in short, specific conversations and then silencing again. The primary phone had 3 emails from Lily's school about picture day, 2 texts from his contractor back in the office about a board meeting he'd asked to be moved, and a calendar reminder for a call with his general counsel at 8 tomorrow morning. He moved the call reminder to 7:30, noted the picture day dates, and put the phone away. He heard the door to the waiting area open and close. He didn't look up immediately. The space filled gradually as the session started, other parents arriving in coats and with coffee cups, but something about the quality of the footsteps on the linoleum made him look. Elena Vasquez was standing 3 chairs away, scanning the rows as though looking for a seat, holding a reusable tote bag and wearing, for the first time since he'd met her, something that wasn't a suit. She had on dark jeans and a green pullover, and her legal pad was not visible anywhere. She looked up, registered him, and stopped in a way that was only slightly less smooth than her usual composure. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Ms. Vasquez." He gestured at the empty chairs. "There's room." She sat 2 chairs away from him, leaving one between them. She was looking through the glass at the pool, and after a moment she said, "My niece. She's in the Tuesday group." "Which one?" "Mia, the one currently arguing with the instructor about whether getting her hair wet is required." He found the child immediately small, with 2 braids escaping from under her swim cap, and an expression of profound philosophical objection aimed at Jalen, who was responding with the patience of someone who'd heard every argument. "She makes a reasonable point," Marcus said. "Freestyle doesn't technically require full submersion. She's 5. She's not doing freestyle." But Elena was almost smiling, watching her niece. She's been debating every adult authority figure in her life since she could form sentences. She'll be a lawyer. God help us. This time the smile arrived fully, briefly, and then she seemed to remember who she was sitting with, and looked back at the pool with slightly more formality than the expression required. They sat in silence for a while. On the pool deck, Lily discovered that if she blew bubbles at exactly the right angle, she could hit the water surface and make a small splash, and she was now demonstrating this to the child next to her with the concentrated energy of a scientist presenting her findings. "She's wonderful," Elena said. She said it quietly, like something she hadn't entirely meant to say out loud. "She is," Marcus said. "She has no fear of anything, which is alternately the best and the most exhausting thing about her." "How long has it been? Just the 2 of you?" He was quiet for a moment. 3 years. Elena didn't push further. She had the quality he was noticing of someone who asked things and then actually waited, who didn't fill silences with more questions just to hear herself covering ground. It was rarer than it should have been. "Her mother," he said. It wasn't something he'd planned to say. "It was a car accident, 3 years ago January." He kept his eyes on the pool. The car had been serviced 2 weeks before. Elena turned to look at him. He could feel it, that careful, complete attention, but he didn't turn back. "The shop that serviced it wasn't one of ours," he said. "I want to be clear about that. It wasn't connected to this investigation in any direct way. But it was." He stopped, started again. It was the reason I started paying attention to what actually happens inside service shops. What the records say versus what the technicians actually do. What customers are told versus what's true. The pool sounds continued the instructor's voice, the splash of small bodies, Lily demonstrating her bubble technique to a third audience member now. "I'm sorry," Elena said. Just that. He nodded once. "Does that information?" she started, and he knew where she was going. "It's not connected to the case," he said. "You don't need to put it in your report. It's context. It's why I know what to look for. That's all." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, "You told me yesterday that there are things you're not ready to tell me. I want you to know that I understand there are reasons people hold back. I've been doing this long enough to know that timing matters." She paused. "But I also want you to know that whatever it is you're not saying, when it becomes relevant, I need to know it before it becomes a liability. For both of us." He finally turned to look at her. In the glow from the pool, with the light off the water doing what light off water does, shifting, unstable, softer than ordinary light, she looked less like the composed professional in a well-cut blazer, and more like someone who was actually tired, and actually trying, and actually uncertain in a way she'd trained herself not to show. "When it becomes relevant," he said, "you'll know." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded and looked back at the pool. They sat there for the rest of the session. They didn't talk much. Lily successfully executed a complete doggy paddle across the width of the lane, climbed out at the far end, and looked immediately toward the glass wall to see if Marcus had seen. He raised one hand. She raised both of hers. Elena's niece, Mia, for the record, made it 3/4 of the way across before deciding she'd proven her point and waiting for Jalen to come get her, which he did without apparent frustration. Marcus drove home with Lily asleep in the back seat before they'd even turned out of the community center parking lot. And he thought about what he had said and what he had not said, and whether the order of things still made sense. He had been careful. He had planned this carefully. The 8 weeks at the shop, the specific access to the systems, the documentation process, the way he'd escalated internally through channels that would be traceable later. He had known when he walked in on day 1 that he would walk out before it was over. He had not entirely planned for the walking out to happen this fast, or for the HR department to move on the complaint faster than his timeline, or for the investigating attorney to be someone who checked metadata as a reflex, and then called him about it at 9:30 at night. He had also not planned to mention Claire. He never mentioned Claire. Not to his board, not to his general counsel, not to anyone except his sister-in-law in the weeks immediately after the accident, and even then, only in the practical terms of what needed to be arranged and who would take Lily on which days. It wasn't that he couldn't talk about her. It was that he had decided somewhere in the 6 months after the accident that if he talked about her in the context of the company, in the context of his motivation, his crusade, whatever people would inevitably call it would stop being about what was right and start being about him. And once it became about him, it became a story someone could use, reshape, dismiss. He hadn't planned to say it tonight. He pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment in the parked truck, listening to Lily's breathing. Even asleep, she had one hand loosely around the strap of her turtle backpack. His second phone buzzed. He checked it. A message from a number he had set up specifically for one contact inside Hale Group's administrative division. A woman named Patricia, who had been his assistant for 6 years and who was the only person other than his general counsel who knew exactly where he was and what he was doing. The message said, DKR escalated. Filing with police tomorrow morning, unauthorized access. Legal says you need to decide tonight. DKR was Diane Catherine Rowe. He read the message twice, then called Patricia. She picked up on the first ring. She's filing a criminal complaint, Patricia said without preamble. Unauthorized access to proprietary company systems. She found out today that the IT department has a log of every time that portal was accessed in the last 90 days, and she's planning to use your login to the internal audit function to build a case that you were an unauthorized intruder. She doesn't know who I am. Not yet. But a criminal complaint means a subpoena, and a subpoena means your real ID comes out through the courts before you're ready. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Has Elena Vasquez been briefed on this? Not from our end, but if Diane is filing tomorrow morning, Ms. Vasquez will find out through the investigation channel within 24 hours. He looked at the dark shape of his house through the windshield. Is the audit log intact? Has anyone tried to modify it? We've been monitoring it. It's clean. Your access records are there exactly as they should be. Okay, he said it the way he said things when the calculation was already done. Don't do anything yet. Let me handle it. Marcus. Patricia's voice shifted slightly. She was the only person in his professional life who called him Marcus rather than Mr. Hale, and she did it precisely when she thought he was about to do something she needed him to reconsider. The investigator, Ms. Vasquez. I looked her up. She's good. I know she's good. Then let her in. He didn't say anything for a moment. In the back seat, Lily shifted and resettled without waking. I'll let her in when the time is right, he said. The time is going to be tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. when Diane Rowe walks into a police station, Patricia said. He ended the call and sat in the dark driveway for a long time, thinking. Elena was already awake when her phone rang the next morning at 7:40. She was at the small desk in her hotel room, the service records from the shop, and the copies Marcus had given her spread in 2 separate stacks. And she had been looking at them side by side for 40 minutes, and finding new discrepancies each time she compared them. Not because they were obvious, but because they were subtle, which meant they had been designed to survive a routine audit, and only fail under the kind of patient, systematic attention that Elena Vasquez happened to specialize in. The call was from her contact at Hale Group HR. I wanted to give you a heads up before it comes through the official channel, the woman said. Diane Rowe submitted a formal complaint to local law enforcement this morning. She's alleging that a former employee, Marcus Hale, committed unauthorized access to proprietary company systems during his time at the Route 9 location. A pause. She submitted it at 8:05. We found out at 8:20. Elena kept her eyes on the papers. Did she provide documentation? Yes. The same email chain and supplementary report she sent to HR 2 days ago. The same documents Elena had already flagged for metadata discrepancies. Thank you, Elena said. I'll handle this. She sat for another moment after she hung up. She thought about what Marcus had told her. She's not careful enough. She's been getting away with it for long enough that she's stopped being careful. She thought about his answer when she'd asked why he'd accessed the management portal. I'll tell you soon. She thought about a 5-year-old saying, your work or your other work. She picked up her phone and looked at Marcus Hale's contact. She did not call him yet. Instead, she opened her laptop and navigated to the Hale Group governance documentation server she had been given secure access as part of her retainer, and searched for the IT Infrastructure Manual 2022 revision. Section 7 was titled Access Tiers and Override Protocols. She read it carefully. Then she read it again. The internal audit override function that Marcus had been accused of accessing without authorization was listed in Section 7, subsection 3. Its access tier was not regional authorization, as Diane had told her. It was what the manual called Tier 1, reserved for corporate governance officers' division heads and one other category. She read the third item in the Tier 1 access list twice to make sure she was reading it right. Tier 1 access is granted to the following roles: Chief Financial Officer, Chief Operations Officer, and the Chief Executive Officer whose credentials are administered directly by the IT Governance Board and are not entered into the Regional Management Portal. She sat very still. The access Marcus had used wasn't above a regional manager's clearance. It was several levels above a regional manager's clearance. It was CEO-level access. She closed the laptop. She opened it again. She pulled up the original personnel file on Marcus Hale, the one Hale Group's HR had provided when she started the engagement, and she read it for the 4th time, looking for something she hadn't looked for before. His social security number, his hire date, his emergency contact field, which was still blank, and the employee ID number at the top right corner. Employee ID 00001. She looked at that for a long time. Then she opened a separate tab and navigated to the Hale Group's corporate registration documents, which were part of the governance server's public filings folder. She clicked through to the original certificate of incorporation from 12 years ago. She scrolled to the signature page. She found it. Marcus J. Hale, Chief Executive Officer and founding member. The signature was the same one she'd seen on the internal complaint form he'd filed 6 weeks ago, because she had that form in the manila envelope in her briefcase, and she opened it now, and she held it next to her screen, and it was the same hand. The same long, slightly compressed M, the same J that curled under, the same Hale where the H was tall and the LE ran together. She sat in her hotel chair and did not move for 30 seconds. Every conversation she'd had with him arranged itself differently. The way he'd known the specific section of the IT manual. The way he'd said the documents Diane submitted were fabricated before anyone could have verified that independently. The way he'd refused to sign any standard form. The way he'd said, "I have a different way of handling this," as if the handling was his to direct. The way Lily had said, "Your other work," and he'd answered without hesitation, automatically before he caught himself. The way he'd walked out of that shop in navy coveralls holding his daughter's hand, not fast and not angry, just deliberate, like a person who already knew what was going to happen next. She picked up her phone and called him. He answered before the second ring had finished. "You need to tell me," she said. Her voice was steady. "Right now." A pause, but not a long one. "What did you find?" "The corporate registration, Section 7 of the IT manual. And your employee ID." Silence. Not the silence of someone caught, but the silence of someone who was, despite everything, relieved. "How long before you can get here?" he asked. She was already reaching for her jacket. 20 minutes, she said. "And Marcus." It was the first time she'd used his name without the formality. She noticed it and kept going. "I need you to understand that I filed a progress report with the Investigation Oversight Committee 2 days ago. If there is any indication of a relationship, any kind of conflict of interest between me and someone connected to this case, my ability to continue this investigation is at risk. My license could be at risk." He was quiet. "I understand," he said. "I don't think you do," she said, "because I'm getting in my car right now anyway." She hung up and grabbed her briefcase. She arrived in 23 minutes, not 20. The 3 extra minutes were because she had stopped the car at the end of Caldwell Street and sat for exactly 180 seconds thinking about what she was doing and why. And then she had driven to number 44 and parked and gotten out, because the thinking had not changed anything. Marcus answered the door before she knocked. He had clearly been standing near it. He was in the same gray Henley from 2 days ago, or one exactly like it, and he looked at her with an expression that was careful and open in equal measure. The specific face of someone who has been holding something for a long time and is now carefully setting it down. "Come in," he said. Lily was at school. The house had the particular quality of quiet that only exists when a child is normally present and currently absent. Not empty, just stilled. He led her to the kitchen table, and this time when he sat down, he put his hands flat on the table in front of him and said, "Ask me." "You're Marcus J. Hale," she said, "CEO and founding member of Hale Automotive Group." "Yes." "You spent 8 weeks working as a line mechanic in your own shop, under your own name, because the name Marcus Hale means nothing to the floor staff at a location like Route 9, he said. "Corporate offices in Arlington, regional managers in suburban facilities, line employees who've been here 3, 4, 5 years and have never had a reason to Google the founder of the company they work for. I didn't need a false name. I just needed coveralls." He paused. "And I needed to see it myself." "Why?" She wasn't asking rhetorically. She wanted the specific answer. He took a breath. 18 months ago, I started seeing discrepancies in the regional performance data for the Mid-Atlantic Division. Numbers that were too consistent. Margins that didn't reflect the operational reality I knew from the ground up. I built this company starting with one shop in Baltimore. I know what real numbers look like. I flagged it internally. I was told it was regional variance, nothing significant. He looked at his hands. I hired 2 outside auditing firms. Both came back with reports that said the books were fine. And you didn't believe them. I couldn't prove they were wrong, but I also couldn't reconcile what the audits were saying with what the internal complaint files were telling me. Because we started getting complaints, Ms. Vasquez. Not formal ones, not through the whistleblower system. Informal ones through our anonymous tip line. Through exit interview records. Workers saying they were being pressured. One complaint said a senior employee had been told to fix his numbers or find another job. He was very still. That phrase. Those exact words. So you went in yourself. I needed documentation on that couldn't be explained away. If I'd gone in as Marcus Hale, CEO, I'd have gotten a prepared shop and coached employees and a performance that had nothing to do with daily operations. I needed to see what the business actually looked like on a Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. Elena had her legal pad open, but had written almost nothing on it. The internal complaint you filed, the one that triggered the whistleblower process, and technically your own termination, did you file that knowing it would escalate to an external investigation? Yes. Did you know my firm would be retained? I recommended Kellerman and Associates to our general counsel. I did not specify you as the investigator. That was their choice. She sat back. Did you tell your general counsel what you were doing? He knew the investigation was coming. He didn't know I was inside the shop. Does anyone know? My assistant Patricia. No one else. Elena looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not dramatically, just the way someone looks when they're fitting pieces into a structure and checking the load-bearing elements. Diane filed a criminal complaint against you this morning, she said. Unauthorized access to company systems. She submitted the fabricated documentation she'd already given to HR. I know. Patricia told me last night. She's going to find out your identity when the police run your social security number. Probably today, he said. Which is why we're having this conversation now. Marcus. She said his name again, and this time it was fully deliberate. When Diane finds out who you are, she's not going to fold. She's going to pivot. She's going to argue entrapment. She's going to argue that the entire investigation is compromised because the CEO of the company orchestrated it. And she is going to look very carefully at every interaction you've had with every person involved in this case, including me. She paused. Including the fact that I was sitting next to you at a community pool last night for 45 minutes. He met her eyes. I know. Do you understand what that means for me, specifically? You could be removed from the investigation. The investigation could be challenged for conflict of interest. Your professional standing. My license? She said. In a worst-case scenario, she said it clearly, without drama, because it was a fact, and she had looked directly at it, and she needed him to look at it too. I want you to understand that I am not telling you this to make you responsible for my choices. I'm telling you so you know exactly what you're asking me to stand next to. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different. Not the careful, precise voice he used when he was managing information, but something quieter and more direct. The voice of someone speaking without the management layer. Claire, he said. My wife. I told you her car had been serviced 2 weeks before the accident. Yes. The shop that serviced it, the mechanic who signed off on the brake inspection, signed off on work he hadn't performed. The brakes weren't inspected. They failed on a rain-slicked road on the 15th of January, 3 years ago. He looked at the center of the table. He wasn't charged with anything. There wasn't enough documentation to prove criminal negligence. The shop's records showed the work was done. The records were wrong, but we couldn't prove they were wrong because the shop had 18 months of clean audits. He looked up. I am not doing this for revenge. I want you to know that. I am doing this because I own 47 shops, and I have found one Diane Rowe, and the existence of one means there may be others, and I need the system that's supposed to prevent this to actually work. Elena held his gaze. She thought about what she was going to write in her report. She thought about what she was legally obligated to disclose versus what was relevant to the investigation. She thought about 9 years of learning to trust documents over people and the specific accumulated cost of that approach. The things she had missed, the people she had been slow to believe, the version of herself that would have looked at Marcus Hale's employee file and seen only the clean surface and not wondered about the depth. "I need to see the full audit log," she said. "The IT system record of your access, the original one that Diane is planning to use as evidence. Can you get it?" "I can get you whatever you need. Today." Today. He reached across the table, not toward her, but toward a laptop that had been sitting closed at the edge. He opened it, typed for a moment, and turned it toward her. "Patricia's sending it now. You should have it in about 30 seconds. Her phone buzzed. The email was there. She opened the audit log attachment and read it on her phone screen. The access records were clear. Marcus J. Hale, Tier 1 credentials, had accessed the internal audit function on 6 separate occasions over an 8-week period. Each access was time-stamped. Each had a corresponding activity record. There was nothing in the log that looked like intrusion. It looked exactly like what it was the CEO reviewing his own company's operational data. She looked up. "This is the same log Diane is presenting to the police as evidence of unauthorized access." "Yes," he said. "She didn't know you were Tier 1. She didn't know I was the CEO." Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She gave me the corporate registration documents herself yesterday as part of the evidentiary package she assembled to use against you. I found your signature in a document she handed me." He looked at her. Something moved across his face, not quite humor, but adjacent to it. "She handed you the proof of who I am as part of the case against me." "She was very thorough," Elena said. "She just didn't read carefully enough." He sat back in his chair. He exhaled slowly. "So what happens now?" "Now," Elena said, "I go back to my hotel. I compile every piece of documentation I have, and I write a report that includes your identity, your methodology, and a full disclosure of every interaction we've had, including last night." She paused. "That report goes to the Investigation Oversight Committee, not to Diane and not to the police. If I do my job right, the committee will see that the documentation was gathered through legitimate channels, that your access was authorized, and that the fabricated evidence Diane submitted is provably false." Another pause. "But that report will also include a note that I had an undisclosed personal conversation with a principal party in this investigation, which means I will likely be suspended from the case. And the investigation continues without you. If I've built the record correctly, it doesn't need me anymore. The record will carry itself." He looked at her for a long moment. "You don't have to do it that way." "I know," she said, "but that's the way I'm going to do it." She stood up and gathered her things. She had the audit log, the corporate registration, the copy of Diane's fabricated documents, the metadata analysis, the original complaint documentation Marcus had given her, the 6 hours of recorded interviews. She had enough. She was at the kitchen doorway when he said her name. She turned. "The community pool," he said. "Last night. That wasn't strategic. I want you to know that." She considered him. She thought about a man who could have told her who he was at any point and had chosen not to. Not because he was hiding, but because he genuinely believed the evidence had to speak without his interference. She thought about how much she recognized that instinct and how different their versions of it were, and how maybe that difference was actually interesting rather than simply inconvenient. "I know," she said. She walked to the front door, and this time he followed her all the way to the porch. "Elena," he said. She stopped. It was the first time he'd used her first name. "When this is over," he said. He didn't finish the sentence, but she understood it completely. "When this is over," she said, and left it there and walked to her car. She drove back to the hotel. She sat at the desk and she began to write. The report was 11 pages. She wrote it in 3 hours, accurately and completely, and included everything. At the bottom of the disclosure section, she wrote, The undersigned investigator discloses that on the evening of March 4th, she was present at the same community facility as the primary subject of this investigation, in a non-professional capacity, and that a personal conversation occurred. Full details are included in Appendix C. The undersigned recognizes that this constitutes a potential conflict of interest and submits herself to the Oversight Committee's determination regarding continued participation in this matter. She saved the document. She sent it. Then she sat at the edge of the hotel bed and looked at the wall for a while. The Oversight Committee convened at 8 in the morning in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in Crystal City, and Elena Vasquez was not in it. She was in the lobby. She was sitting in a chair near the window with a cup of terrible lobby coffee and her phone face down on her knee because she had made her report, and it was no longer her room to be in. That was the rule. That was the correct application of the rule. She believed in the correct application of the rule with the same conviction she brought to everything. And she was sitting in the lobby chair with her jaw set and her hands steady, and the particular quality of patience that looks like calm but is really just discipline held very tightly. Her phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. She knew who it was because Patricia had introduced herself 2 days ago via text with exactly this level of indirection. Committee started on time. Diane's counsel is present. DKR brought her own attorney, which means she knew this was coming. Elena typed back, "How did she know?" A pause. Then the police ran MJH's information this morning. She found out at approximately 7:45. I imagine she spent the next hour making calls. Elena looked at the lobby ceiling. Diane had found out Marcus was the CEO at 7:45 and had shown up at the committee meeting with a lawyer by 8, which meant the attorney had been on standby, which meant she had been prepared for this contingency at least partially. That was not nothing. That was someone who had spent 18 months constructing a careful fraud and had somewhere in the back of her mind always been preparing for the moment it fell apart. The lobby coffee was genuinely terrible. Elena drank it anyway. 40 minutes passed. Her phone buzzed twice more, both from her firm's managing partner, both asking for status, both answered with the same 3 words, waiting to hear. Then a 4th buzz, this one from a number she recognized. Marcus. They asked me to come up. I thought you should know. She typed, "Go." The conference room had a long table and 8 people in it, and the specific pressurized quality of a room where something important is about to be decided, and everyone knows it, but no one will say so out loud. Marcus sat at one end. He was in a suit, not a particularly expensive one by his standards, a dark charcoal with a white shirt and no tie, which was how he dressed for meetings where he wanted to be taken seriously but not performed at. And he had the IT audit log on a laptop, Appendix C of Elena's report on his phone screen, and the manila envelope she'd given him 3 days ago sitting on the table in front of him. Diane was at the other end. Her attorney was next to her, a woman named Galloway, who Marcus recognized from 2 previous corporate litigation matters, not as an adversary, but as a presence. She was sharp, and she would make this take longer than it needed to. Diane herself looked controlled. She had worn a blazer he hadn't seen before, which meant she'd planned her appearance for this specific morning. Her hands were flat on the table. The committee chair, a man named Bertram, who had worked as Hale Group's outside governance counsel for 9 years, opened with procedural matters. Marcus listened to them with partial attention and devoted the rest of his focus to watching Diane watch the room. She was doing what careful people do when they know the floor under them has changed. She was recalculating. He could see it in the speed of her eye movements, the way she tracked each committee member's face. She was mapping alliances, figuring out who she had leverage with, who was neutral, who was already against her. She hadn't figured out what Elena's report actually contained yet. Her attorney had clearly reviewed the report, but Diane's expression when Marcus had walked in had shifted in a way that told him she'd been briefed on its existence, but not its full contents. She had expected he thought that Elena's disclosure would be damaging to the investigation, a conflict of interest that could be used to challenge the evidentiary record. What she had not expected was that Elena would preemptively disclose everything, frame it accurately, and make the record bulletproof before it could be attacked. Bertram finished the procedural section. We have before us the investigative report from Kellerman and Associates, the supplementary evidentiary documentation, and an audit log from the company's IT governance board confirming the nature of the system access at issue. He looked down the table. Ms. Rowe, you've been advised that this proceeding relates to the accuracy of conduct reports you submitted in the period between January 15th and March 2nd of this year, and a subsequent criminal complaint filed this morning. Your counsel has reviewed the documentation. Would you like to make a statement? Diane's attorney put a hand briefly on her client's arm. Ms. Rowe declines to make an opening statement at this time, she said. All right. Bertram turned to Marcus. Mr. Hale? The documentation speaks for itself, Marcus said. I'd like to direct the committee's attention to 3 specific items. The metadata analysis on the conduct reports Ms. Rowe submitted, all of which were created after the dates printed on them. The access tier documentation confirming that my use of the internal audit function was authorized under my CEO credentials, and the original corporate registration bearing my signature, which Ms. Rowe herself included in the evidentiary package she assembled against me. He paused for half a beat. I'd also ask the committee to note that the criminal complaint filed this morning describes the same system access that the IT audit log confirms was Tier 1 authorized. Ms. Rowe filed a complaint against the CEO of this company for accessing the CEO's own records. One of the committee members made a sound that was not quite a cough. Diane's attorney leaned in and said something quietly to Diane. Diane's jaw tightened. She looked at Marcus for the first time since he'd walked in. This entire investigation was orchestrated, Diane said. Her attorney touched her arm again. Diane ignored her. You came in as a plant. You filed a complaint against yourself to trigger an external review, and then you selected the investigating attorney. The whole thing is compromised. Ms. Rowe, Bertram began. The investigating attorney disclosed a conflict of interest voluntarily, Marcus said, keeping his voice level. She did so before anyone required her to, and in doing so, she created a record that shows exactly the nature and timing of every interaction. The disclosure is in Appendix C. It doesn't invalidate the investigation. It validates it because every step is documented and traceable. He kept his eyes on Diane. The same cannot be said for the conduct reports you submitted. You have no idea what kind of pressure. She stopped herself. Ms. Rowe, Bertram said more firmly. Diane's attorney gripped her client's arm. My client has no further comment at this time, she said. The room was very quiet for a moment. Ms. Rowe, Bertram said in the tone of someone who has made a decision. The committee is going to take a brief recess to review the documentation. When we reconvene, we will be asking you to respond in writing to specific factual questions about the conduct reports and the service record entries flagged in the investigative report. Your attorney will advise you on how to proceed. He looked around the table. I'll note for the record that in 31 years of governance work, I have never seen a case in which the evidence submitted against a party was submitted by that same party. He closed his folder. 15 minutes. He found Elena in the lobby. He'd known she would be there. Patricia had told him, and he'd known anyway, because he had spent the past 3 weeks developing a reasonably accurate internal model of where Elena Vasquez would be when things were happening. She was near the window, sitting with an empty coffee cup and her phone face down on her knee, and she looked up when he came out of the elevator. He sat in the chair beside her. How's it going? She said. Diane tried to go on offense, he said. Her attorney shut her down, but she got out about 30 words before that. She said the whole investigation was compromised because I orchestrated it. Elena absorbed this. What did you say? I pointed to Appendix C. Something relaxed in her expression. Not relief exactly, but the close relative of it. And the committee, they're reviewing documentation. Bertram made a dry comment about 31 years of governance work. I think he's fine. He paused. I think it's going to be all right. She nodded. She looked back out the window. "Elena," he said. She looked at him. "Your report. The way you wrote it." He stopped for a moment because he wanted to say this precisely. "You wrote it in a way that protected the evidence, even at cost to yourself. You didn't frame the disclosure in a way that minimized it or buried it. You made it the clearest part of the document." "That's how it should be written," she said. "I know." He paused. "I'm saying I see what it cost." She looked at him for a long moment. The lobby was moving around them, people with visitor badges, someone with a rolling cart of boxes. The low hum of a building in use, and they were sitting in it the way they'd sat in the parents' waiting area of a community pool, with one chair between them, and a specific, deliberate quality to the space they were keeping. "They suspended me from the case," she said, "pending the conflict review." "I know, Patricia told me. She was right to. The committee was right to." Elena said it without bitterness, just with the even-keeled accuracy of someone who has thought it through and arrived at the same answer from every angle. "I should have told you who I was the moment I found your signature. I should have called the committee chair before I called you." "You called me first," he said. "I called you first," she said. A pause. Neither of them addressed what that meant because they didn't need to, because it had already been said in the gap between the calling and the answering. "Patricia is going to keep me updated," he said, "on the committee's decision on what happens with Diane. I'll make sure you know everything as it happens." She nodded. He looked at the window at the Crystal City street outside gray-blue morning, a few taxis, a woman walking a very large dog who appeared to have somewhere urgent to be. "There's something I want to tell you," he said. "Not about the case." She turned back to him. "The policy I'm announcing next week," he said. "The expanded whistleblower protection program. Internal reporting channels with guaranteed immunity from retaliation. Independent review boards. Automatic, external audit triggers when a complaint is filed." He paused. "I'm naming it after Claire, my wife." Elena was quiet. "I've been thinking about what you said, about whether I'm doing this for the right reasons." He looked at his hands. "The answer is both. I'm doing it because it's the right thing for 47 shops and the people who work in them and the customers who trust us. And I'm doing it because Claire deserved better than what happened, and there are people out there right now getting the wrong brake inspection and the wrong service record, and there is something I can actually do about that." He looked up. "I don't think those two reasons cancel each other out." "They don't," she said. She said it quietly, the way she'd said, "I'm sorry," at the community pool, not as a comfort, but as a statement of fact she had arrived at after actual consideration. "They're the same reason." He held her gaze. The lobby was still moving around them, and they were still sitting with one chair between them. And Elena was looking at him with the particular expression of someone who has spent a long time being very careful and is now in the presence of something that requires a different kind of attention. "When this is over," he said. "You said that before," she said. "I mean it more specifically this time." She considered him. "How specifically?" "I'd like to have dinner with you," he said. "Not with any agenda connected to this investigation. Not with anything to report or disclose. Just dinner." Elena looked back at the window for a moment. The large dog on the sidewalk had apparently resolved its urgency and was now sitting very calmly next to its owner, looking at the street with the mild satisfaction of a creature who knows where it stands. "When this is over," she said. And this time, the phrase was a yes, unambiguous and calm, and arrived at the way Elena arrived at everything, by looking directly at it and deciding. The committee reconvened at 9:15. Bertram presented their preliminary findings. The metadata evidence was sufficient to establish that the conduct reports submitted against Marcus Hale had been created after their stated dates. The IT audit log confirmed that the system access at issue was authorized under credentials held by the CEO, and the investigative record compiled by Kellerman and Associates was found to have been gathered through legitimate channels in the period prior to any potential conflict of interest. Diane's attorney presented a motion to dismiss the investigation on grounds of orchestration and bias. The committee rejected it in 4 minutes. At 9:47, the committee chair made a formal referral to the company's legal team for action against Diane Rowe on charges of document falsification, financial misconduct related to service record fraud, and harassment of an internal whistleblower. The referral also included a recommendation for criminal prosecution referral to the district attorney's office for the service record fraud, given that the falsified records had resulted in customers being billed for work not performed under warranty claims. Diane Rowe sat very still while this was read. Her attorney was writing quickly on a legal pad. Diane's hands, which had been flat on the table all morning, were no longer flat. They were pressed together, fingertip to fingertip, the way hands are when someone is holding something in that has nowhere to go. "Ms. Rowe," Bertram said after the referral was complete, "do you have anything to say for the record?" A long pause. Her attorney started to speak. Diane stopped her with a slight movement. "I built the best regional numbers in the Mid-Atlantic Division," Diane said. "For 4 years. No one asked how." Bertram looked at her evenly. "Someone should have," he said. "That's also part of what this committee is here to address." He closed his folder. The meeting was adjourned. Marcus stepped outside at 10:15 into a morning that had warmed slightly. The kind of March day that can't quite decide between winter and spring and compromises by being both at once. He called Patricia. He called his general counsel. He called Lily's school to confirm he'd be at pickup at 3:30. Then he called Elena. She picked up on the first ring. "Referral to the DA's office," he said. "Formal action on the document falsification and the service record fraud. Diane's attorney is already filing a response, but the committee's evidentiary record is solid. The criminal complaint against me has been withdrawn." A pause. "The conflict of interest review for you, Bertram, said it's a formality given the disclosure timeline. He expects it to be resolved by end of week." On the other end of the line, he heard her exhale. Just once, short and controlled, but he heard it. "Good," she said. "Elena." He looked at the street. "Thank you for the way you wrote that report." "I told you," she said. "It's how it should be written." "I know," he said. "I'm saying it again anyway." A brief pause. He could hear faintly in the background of her end what sounded like the inside of a car, the ambient hum of a vehicle, maybe her putting the phone on speaker. "I have a call with my managing partner in 10 minutes, she said. "And then I'm going to spend the rest of the day doing something that has nothing to do with any of this." "What?" "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the point." He almost laughed. He didn't quite, but she seemed to hear the part of it that arrived anyway, because her voice, when she said goodbye, had a quality that hadn't been there in the lobby. Something lighter. Something that was specifically for him. 15 days later, Elena Vasquez opened a 2-room office on the 4th floor of a building in Georgetown. The windows faced east and got good morning light, which she had specified as a requirement when she had signed the lease, because she had spent 9 years in offices that faced parking structures, and she had decided this was the year to stop accepting that. The office had a small reception area and a larger main room with a desk and 2 chairs for clients, and a window with a view of a side street with a coffee shop on the corner. She had a laptop and a printer and the legal pad and exactly 1 plant which she had purchased the day before at a farmer's market on the advice of no one except her own instinct that a plant would help, and which was a type of low-maintenance succulent that the vendor had described as, quote, essentially impossible to kill. She was setting up the printer when someone knocked on the open door. Marcus was standing in the doorway in a jacket she hadn't seen before, a deep navy that suited him, holding 2 coffees from the shop on the corner. He looked around the office. The desk, the east-facing window, the succulent still in its paper bag, and then at her. "Good light," he said. "I specified it in the lease." She wiped her hands on her jeans and walked toward him. He offered the coffee. She took it. They were standing close enough that this happened without anyone stepping specifically toward the other, which was something she noticed and did not comment on. "You didn't call ahead," she said. "I was in the neighborhood." "You're the CEO of a company headquartered in Arlington. You're not in the neighborhood." "I'm in the neighborhood now," he said. He looked at the succulent bag. "Do you need help with that?" It's a plant.
I can manage a plant. The printer. She considered the printer, which was still not connected to anything.
Possibly, she said.
He set his coffee on the corner of her desk, and she watched him cross to the printer, assess it with the specific attention of someone who has spent 8 weeks diagnosing mechanical systems, and begin connecting the cable.
Marcus, she said. He looked up. The dinner, she said. You mentioned dinner. I did. This is over now, she said, meaning the case, the investigation, the conflict review, which had been resolved 4 days ago, exactly as Bertram had predicted. This is the after. I know, he said. She looked at him for a moment, at the man who had walked out of his own shop in navy coveralls holding his daughter's hand, and looked even then like he knew where he was going. At the man who had sat next to her in a plastic chair at a community pool and talked about his wife without being asked, because he had made the calculation that she deserved the truth. At the man who had answered his phone before the second ring, when she called to tell him she'd found his signature, as if he'd been waiting. Tonight, she said. Tonight, he said. He stood up. The printer's connected. She turned on the printer and it ran a test page, and the paper that came out was clean and white and completely empty, which felt, in the specific warm light of that particular Thursday morning, like the right place to start.